Well, hello everybody and welcome to the final session of the day. I appreciate all of you who are sticking around and not other places where there might be, yes, booze. It's been a long day of actually great sessions here. This is our last panel on developing world identity. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable. We're a law firm in town, though I'm not a lawyer. That's a longer story. I also serve as the coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition, which is a trade organization focused on making identity better. I'm real excited for this panel in part because I think it focuses on some things that are a bit different from the rest of the focus of this conference. So if you've been here for a couple days, you've been in a lot of sessions probably on enterprise identity, figuring out how you provision accounts and manage privileged users and things like that. A lot of discussions on the consumer space around how we're going to validate or authenticate consumers, but in many cases there's a few things that we're assuming, like, oh, we'll have an app that will scan their driver's license or their passport, which works really well in certain parts of the world. And one thing we want to focus on today is that there's still, is it over a billion? 1 billion. 1 billion people roughly, give or take, it's a big number, that don't really have any legal form of identity. And so that's just really not an option. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of how identity can help people here, in terms of empowering them, giving them just the ability to just be able to prove who they are, can be a real important key to accessing basic services that you might need in life, be them from the government, from financial services industry, things online, or at a more basic level, just being able to prove that you actually exist, and the ability to avoid all sorts of unsavory situations in terms of well, basically the world that you're forced into if you don't have a way to prove that. The flip side is, and this is a concern I always have, is there's a lot of ways that identity systems can do harm. I've always pointed out that as long as there have been identity systems for at least the last couple thousand years, identity has been used to persecute and sometimes kill people. And so when we get things wrong, or if we build systems with the best of intentions, but then something goes wrong, the results can be, kind of devastating for people. And, to be clear, I'm not just talking about things in the developing world. One example I've given here in the U.S. over the last few years is during the Obama administration, because of the effort with DACA and the Dreamers, essentially encouraging people who were here who were undocumented to come out of the woodwork, register to be able to stay here legally. One of the promises was, well, if we're creating this database, we will make sure, it's not used in the wrong hands. And suddenly if you have regime change or here a presidential election and very different politics, that can suddenly start to change the equation. And by the way, I don't mean this at all as a political statement. Actually, maybe I do a little bit personally, but just more as an example of an identity system built for one purpose with a certain set of politics or policy or leaders behind it. When governments change, as they often do, can have some really important consequences. So I'm looking forward today to talking about some things that are going on in the world, both exciting opportunities as well as where there's challenges, and maybe a chance to have a discussion around what's the right path forward. So we're going to start off with Vyjayanti Desai, who's the program manager for the ID for Development program at the World Bank Group. Adam Cooper, who's the chief architect for ID 2020 and also does some work with the bank, will then speak next to provide some of his perspectives. And then I'm excited we're going to have a chance to dig into the work that Kaliya Young, Identity Woman, as many of you know her, has done based on a grant she got from the New America Foundation to explore the Aadhaar Program in India and some observations and thoughts that she has there. So let me start with you.
Thank you for this opportunity, Jeremy, and look forward to an active discussion afterwards, which will be more interesting than the presentation itself. So we estimate 1 billion people globally who are unable to prove themselves officially. So this is official forms of identification, and about 50% are in sub-Saharan Africa, and a little bit below 50% are children below national ID or voter ID age. We also know that even those within low-income countries, it's women who are less likely to have ID than a man, and as well as the poorest quintile of the population. So it's really at the heart of the people that we care the most about when we're working in institutions like World Bank from a development perspective. And the reason why the World Bank Group, because Jeremy had asked to explain a bit about why we engaged on this topic from a development institution, and we see ID really serving as a foundational platform for a number of different development goals, whether it's financial inclusion. We know the importance for ID for KYC purposes. We've seen in countries such as India how Aadhaar plus additional interventions helped increase financial inclusion from 35% to 80% in just 6 years, or the role of ID for women's empowerment. So in Pakistan, how ID was used for the female head of households to receive benefits for the large cash transfer program that targeted the bottom 20% of the population, and how that not only helped ensure that the female head of the households received the payments in their hands, but it also had other side effects, like ensuring that the money was then used for children's education and health, the family. Or in Thailand, how the ID was allowed stateless children, we talked about stateless, to attend school. So this is why the Bank Group engaged on this about 4 years ago, and we continue it as a cross-sectoral initiative across multiple parts of the World Bank Group, whether it's the social protection team, governance, financial sector, digital development, and several others. We also know the importance of ID to really serve as a foundation of trust and privacy in the digital economy. And we've seen in many countries a move towards paperless, cashless, and presenceless transactions. But also with that is the role of data empowerment. And we're starting to see a paradigm shift in a positive direction of countries trying to invest in models where the individual has greater control over their data and identity. So what we've been doing is we have 3 pillars of support on analytics, global convening and platforms, and then most importantly, how this fits into our country and regional work with our country clients. And just very quickly on each of those 3 pillars. So on analytics, this is some examples of the pieces of work that we've put out in this last year. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but it just shows you, and they're all on our website as global public goods that we don't charge anything for. So it's meant to be for a consumption and to really further the agenda. So why ID is important, so such as public sector savings, private sector savings, for example. We have seen in a number of countries how having an ID system reduced the onboarding cost tremendously by, in some cases, even 90%. The role of ID in agriculture, health, and financial inclusion, but also a number of pieces of work on how to build robust and trusted ID systems. And so we've just recently put out a practitioner's guide that I wouldn't be turned away by the 200-some pages, because it's actually written in a very user-friendly way. And it's open for consultation right now. So we'd love any of your thoughts and feedback on that so that we can continue to see it as a living document. But also things like the cost drivers, privacy by design, which is critical because I'll go into that in a bit, but what examples of countries that have looked at privacy by design features, and then other case studies. On the global convening and platforms, so I think many have heard about the great slogan, the branding of good ID, and we take that very seriously because, as Jeremy mentioned, we're in this because of the development goal. We're in this because we see inclusion and trust and a lot of development benefits that can be gained. But at the same time, we know that there are potential risks in these systems. And so instead of talking about it, we're actually walking the talk and putting our money where our mouth is and doing things to help countries actually move in that trajectory of good ID. So we started with bringing together 25 organizations on developing the principles of identification for sustainable development, which has been a bit of a North Star of what are the good outcomes that we want to see from these ID systems, which is not just a piece of paper. These 10 principles have been adopted by the countries that we support and really taking it to heart and seeing how they can help move in that direction. But not just stopping there, moving towards then supporting countries on helping on their legal and regulatory frameworks. So we know that in about half of the countries in Africa and many of our other clients don't have sound data protection laws and frameworks. And so this ID enabling environment tool allows us to go into a country, see what the ecosystem is, what laws and regulations exist, and how that sits vis-a-vis good practice standards, and then provide that technical assistance and support to countries to move in that direction. We've also been looking at open standards, and with both Jeremy and Adam's help and several other standards organizations, pulled together this user-friendly guide of technical standards that exist so that we can ensure that when these systems are being designed, it's using the existing standards that are already out there. We also are looking not only at the laws and regulations, but also, as I mentioned, privacy by design. So we held an innovation challenge recently called Mission Billion, and it's Mission Billion because of the billion people without a way of proving who they are, to really crowdsource innovative solutions for protecting user control, user privacy and control through system design. And several winners was meant to not for the highlight of an event, but really to take these great ideas and start infusing them into our country dialogue. And last on the slide is an open source ID platform. So this is not something that's often talked in these conferences, I believe, in these settings, but is very much talked about in conferences with our country clients in Africa and Asia, which is that many of these ID systems are built and with proprietary solutions, and countries end up being locked into a solution for 10 years or more. And so we embarked with several of our donor partners to think about what it would take to really break that model and think about more open source. And so MOSIP is going to be implemented and rolled out in a couple of countries over the next calendar year, and hopefully more in the future. And then last on our country work, this is just a list of the countries where we've been supporting on assessments and advisory, as well as financing of systems, both on ID as well as civil registration, birth registration systems. And these are some examples in West Africa, looking at 5 countries in West Africa, not only for support on the system itself, but also mutual recognition across borders and sort of that interoperability and trust framework, very much inspired by the European approach as well. Somalia, a country where there's only 3% birth registration rates. It's a country that relies heavily on remittances, but yet, incapable of ensuring that those remittances can make their way to the intended people without official forms of identification. In Philippines, where also it's coming up with the design of a universal system. And I think the title, I'm going to end right there, but the title of this was Global ID. What was it?
Identity in the developing world.
Oh, okay, so it had changed. But what we were not doing, and some people misunderstand that we are putting in place a single ID system for the entire globe. That's not what we're doing. We're supporting individual countries in what Adam had mentioned, building these authoritative sources to ensure that people can prove who they are, both for a number of the development purposes, but also for online and the digital economy.
Thanks. Adam.
Thank you. I don't have any slides. I'm not going to bore you with that. I've already done slides today, so I'm just going to talk. And what I want to talk about are some of the problems that you have when you're trying to put in place these country-scale identity systems, and some of the things that we have to deal with, all of us, when we're implementing those. So if you think about a reasonably large country like India, which Kaliya is going to talk about hopefully in a little while, and where you've got over 1 billion people, how do you go about capturing information about those 1 billion people and making sure you do that reliably? It's a massive operational problem. It's not really a technology problem in many ways. It's a huge operational problem. How do you get out to all of those regions? How do you make sure you capture all the people? How do you run the process and do it quickly, because you don't want it to take forever? And then reliably maintain that over time. So how do you deal with when people's biometrics change because their fingerprints change over time, because that's just reality, or if they can't register in the same way as everybody else. So where are the edge cases, which in a large population like that become thousands of people, not just one or two? There's some big problems to solve there, and I can't say hand on heart that we've solved all those problems. I think there's lots of things that we can still do to make that better. But one of the good things is that because things like Aadhaar have happened, we can learn from them. So we can learn from how that system was built, and we've seen that in that life cycle, and I don't want to steal all of Kaliya's presentation, so I'll stop talking about India in a moment, but because of those large-scale implementations, we can get some really good learning about how would we have done things better if we'd have if we'd known what we know now. And that's one of the things that we try to do, is we try to have this positive feedback loop. The other thing that I'm really interested in is what we do with children in this equation. So there's some really good reasons why we might want to start identifying children as part of this, which we don't normally do. Normally we capture the identity of young adolescents as they get to school age, for example. That's quite often the case. Vyjayanti was just mentioning that in many countries you have to have a birth certificate, for example, to enter school. But it's actually quite useful when you're running things like immunisation programs to be able to make sure that you can reliably immunise the same child repeatedly. Why? Because it might actually protect that child's life. And it's a very important thing. It makes you more efficient with the immunisation as well. It means that less mistakes are made. So it actually builds improvements in that service. And as a knock-on effect, because you're interacting with the mother at this point, or certainly the guardians of that child, you can start to look for, have those individuals been registered? Do they exist in a birth register? Because quite often they don't. As Vyjayanti outlined, quite often women, for example, are the least representative in some of these countries. And that's a real problem. So if you can interact with them at different life stages, like they're about to give birth, so we're providing them with healthcare as a country, it's an opportunity to then get them into the system and get them registered if possible. So these kind of things and these processes are things that I'm quite interested in, but how do you then solve the problem of the infant biometrics? Because that's a real problem at the moment. There are one or two systems that claim, and I'm going to say claim even though I've seen the tech, to be able to identify reliably a child's biometric from just a few hours old. Now that sounds incredible, but I've seen the tech. Technically it exists and it could work, but there's no real information about that. There have been no large-scale trials yet. So one of the things I like to get involved in is encouraging, and this is some of the work that ID 2020 does, is encouraging some actual real-life pilots where we run these things at scale and get some real data back so that we can start to figure out, does this stuff work? So that's something that I think needs to be encouraged more. Quite often it gets stepped away from by governments because they want reliability, because there's nothing they can point to at the moment. But I think it's something we need to, elsewhere in the system, try and engineer. And it's good that we can address that. I think the other thing, just going back to something Jeremy said earlier, is creating these identities actually creates risk. And he's quite right. Ever since identity in the technical sense has existed, it's been used for nefarious purposes and often to abuse people. And that's something that we constantly have to be aware of. That identity, and the more advanced it gets, has more potential to be weaponized. And that's a real concern. And that's why I'm very concerned about how we manage these systems and make sure that governments are doing the right things, which is where it comes to a lot of the standards work that Vyjayanti was talking about, making sure that we can intervene early on and make sure that privacy by design is built into these systems, to make sure that the correct security and cybersecurity is built into these systems, to stop the over-gathering of data, and to make sure that we can, as much as possible, put the individual in control to prevent the overuse of data. So all of these things matter, and I can't say we've solved them all yet. It's still an ongoing battle, but I think we are slowly getting there, and that's important.
Okay, can you put my slides up, please? So, I had the opportunity to travel to India as part of a New America India U.S. Public Interest Technology Fellowship. So 3 of us traveled to India, and 7 folks from India traveled to Washington, D.C. here, and spent 7 weeks in country, and then a week together afterwards. And so I'm just sharing some of my findings while I was there exploring Aadhaar, because I'd heard so much about it and needed to sort of get on the ground and talk to folks who are actually there to form my own opinion. So, can we advance the slide? Do you have advancing slides working? It's supposed to be like in Adobe presentation mode. No, that's bigger and smaller. Oh no, can we, it's a PDF and you need to put it in Adobe like Viewer. I'll talk about the first few slides. India's really, 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 really big. It's a federal system, similar. It has 29 states and 1.3 billion people. It also has 250,000 local administrative units, similar to U.S. counties. So it's huge. So they started looking at how to do national identity in sort of around the turn of the millennium, and a bunch of different options were put forward. One of them was they have a national population register, and they have birth and, yay, that's perfect. And they have a lot of languages. So this is something that's different than the United States. It's just a lot. These things. So the other thing is that it's also, there's important aspects of thinking about these things that have to do with like colonial history and also the post-colonial history. And this book is fantastic. In Pursuit of Proof, A History of Identification Documents in India. I bought it and I read it right as it got right when I got to my door. Anyways, I'm such an identity nerd, but I recommend these 2 books to you if you want to go into the... So in India, identity was primarily done at the family level with a ration card system that had been that's in some ways still in place, but had been in place from the time of the Second World War. And so this is what I was starting, National Population Ledger, but this, one of the subjects that I spoke to was really clear about the issues around Aadhaar. Part of their issue was that constitutionally, the local government had the responsibility to register people, and they had real questions about the choice to have this happening at the national level. If you want to read in the ins and outs of the politics, I recommend this book. There's actually 4 books about Aadhaar. We'll get to more of them later. So Nandan Nilekani came on board. He was a very charismatic leader, and he was named as a cabinet member, but not elected to parliament. And they started the Unique Identity Authority of India with a startup culture. And the way I frame it is they created a minimum viable ID, and it had 4 pieces of demographic information and 13 biometrics. And they also collect your phone number and your email address and bank account information. So this is the forum, and you can see those fields that are often not mentioned in the public dialogue about it. Here's a registration station where somebody's getting registered. And these sort of setups, the technology, were actually sold to entrepreneurs who would go out and register people, which was one of the innovations that they had. So the enrollment process, someone would go through, the information is sent to the central identity repository. They would be checked for uniqueness against their biometrics and then issued a unique number. And this was sent out on a card with 0 security features. like printed off. And if you didn't get your card in the mail, you could print it out at your local computer shop. This is the enrollment process that I drew out. So this is where it starts. The resident sort of interacts with the operator, sharing their biometrics and demographics, and they get a receipt. And then the information flows up to the enrollment agencies. So they got state-level governments and banks and a whole range of institutions to be enrollers of people. And then it goes all the way, how does it happen? Anyways, the information goes to the UIDAI. This is the central authority. And then once they decide to issue a number, they send it over to the post office, who then mails it to the resident. And this, the green line is sort of the payments that went from UIDAI out. So they paid each registrar 50 rupees per enrollment, and then down the line, like I think operators got 25 rupees per enrollment. So they used this sort of entrepreneurial incentive to get entrepreneurs to go out and register people into the system, which is kind of a genius thing to do. They also made deals with state-level governments who they kind of got to participate, that they would share the Aadhaar number with the state-level government in the process of enrollment. So security researchers in India that I connected with actually looked at the code in the that's used by the operators, and it's sending data both to the central data repository and also to these state resident data hubs managed at the state level. And this is an example of a slide from one of the states in India, sort of sharing how they're taking the enrollment data, putting it in their state level database, and then connecting it up to all the different databases they have at the state level about citizens. And so this is from, I think this is from AP, so this is all their different department databases that they're pulling into one sort of big database. And then they did both organic and inorganic seeding. So organic seeding was that individuals asserted their Aadhaar numbers and they were added into their files in these records. And inorganic was where they took Aadhaar numbers and pushed them into existing data sets. And then some states actually went out and added more information to the state level data. And this is an example of a survey from Telangana that they did on everybody. So it's all sorts of information about folks, including how much livestock they have, how many bicycles, what the roof is made of, all sorts of things. And then they also had put this data into apps that could be used to see all the information about residents at the state level. So this is sort of this vision of like connecting everything up. So there's 5 ways to authenticate with Aadhaar. So this is all like sort of getting yes/no answers back, and then they added this other piece around supporting eKYC, sort of like digital documents to comply with KYC requirements for both banks and telcos. But this was not originally part of their plan. It was added after. So this is an example of like a resident sharing their biometric and with the bank. Oh, here, woo! And then the biometric data being sent. This is their biometrics. Woo! Sent to the UIDAI and getting a yes/no back before they complete the transaction. And I drew out the eKYC flow so that the resident is sharing their biometrics and Aadhaar number, and then and then the UIDAI is sending back their name and address back up to the phone company. So the vision that the folks building this, the India stack, have is that the Aadhaar number will sort of be the middle of everything. So there's some challenges, I think. I kept hearing this idea that there is a single source of truth, and this is a computer science model that's being applied to people, which may be not a great thing. There's limited transparency into how the system's actually built. And reporters, security researchers, and NGOs who point out flaws in the systems are being subject to first incident reports, which are criminal investigations instigated by the UIDAI. There is 0 security features on the cards, which is like a good thing and a bad thing in some ways. And the other challenge is culturally, there's this norm of photocopying these cards for all sorts of things. So there's piles of photocopies of Aadhaar cards, like a lot of places. The sub-authentication agencies are not common. So, to get into an airport, you have to present your ticket and your 0 security feature card to the guy at the door. And the other issue, too, is they have one-time password OTPs that you can send to your phone, but in India, not everybody has a phone. And in villages, often people would have put the phone number of the head guy, the head of their village, on the form. So now you're going to use that to access services or your bank account. They're going to be in the middle of that transaction, helping you get the OTP. They also have a DigiLocker, which pulls together all of your documents from different entities that are all linked to your Aadhaar number. But and this is sort of like under the control of the user, except the government sees all the things in your locker, which people pointed out was like the government gave me all those documents anyways. So. Good things about Aadhaar are that it's a universal ID, and because everybody has one, it's universally accepted. So it's like really, like many people I talked to were like really happy about their Aadhaar because it reduced their sort of administrative paperwork overhead in dealing with a whole range of institutions. And it's also been used and able to support benefits transfer for people. Critics point out that these benefits transfer systems were working before. It's hard to figure out. And the other thing that they've done is build a unified payments interface, which has transformed banking across India and sort of gotten, like it's basically a free payments interface where you can just send money knowing someone's phone number or Aadhaar. There's a lot of debate. So these guys are against Aadhaar. That's Nandan's book that's really pro-Aadhaar, and this one's sort of balanced in the middle if you want to read more. And there's all the things together. So, and my New America research, I think, will be actually published in a couple weeks.
Great. Thanks, Kaliya. So we've got about 7 minutes left. Does anybody have questions?
If I'm getting it right, so one of the things when we've been collecting the data set on that the 1 billion estimate comes from our ID4D data set, which is by no means a perfect data set, but it's in absence of having accurate statistics in countries on who has official forms of identity. We've been looking at in household surveys whether or not to ask that question and what forms. That's problematic because the household surveys are done every few years and it's not rolled out in all the countries at the same time, so it's not a perfect. Since what we had done a couple of years ago is we added 3 questions into the Findex survey that is rolled out in a bit over 100 countries, and asked about ID coverage. And so some of the figures that I showed you on the women, the gap in women in low-income countries comes from that. We are going to repeat that again next year. This is Gallup survey that will be rolled out next year, and again, over 100 countries. Well, I mean, those surveys are all anonymized, right? So, so it's for household surveys. So you don't want to be collecting their identity number. But yes, I mean, in terms of increasing the strength of knowing the gap in the coverage and the issues, we are thinking about investing much more than we have in the past.
Could you speak a little bit to attitudes on the ground about the people who are receiving an identity sometimes for the first time?
So we've been doing, increasingly doing end user research. We've rolled it out in about 6 countries and we'll be doing many more. And, you know, very much it depends, and with a particular focus on marginalized populations. And, you know, the benefits the drivers and the benefits is what gets people to enroll in an ID system, because they see for the first time that they're able to, you know, receive, for example, the cash transfer programs in their own hands. Like, for example, I would urge also Kaliya to review some of the survey work that Alan Gelb and Center for Global Development has done, which people, it sometimes increases trust, is sometimes inconvenience, but increases trust because they know that they're not going to be cheated from some of the food ration operators, for example, receiving the food rations, that they know that there's much more transparency and delivery of public services. I think the other that is interesting, you know, Kaliya, you mentioned the card, the household card, the family card. We've heard women who say it's nice for the first time that you can have a form of identity that's yours and not in your husband's name. So there are some of those, but we want to do much more, because right now we've only rolled it out in 6 countries, and we actually want this to be a standard for any of our country work that we support.
Sorry, this might be too specific, but by any chance, do you cooperate with Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina? It's Plaza de Mayo grandmothers. They are kind of into the identity work, but just no.
I'm not aware. No,
No,
sorry.
okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Steve Wilson from Constellation Research. Jeremy made the really interesting, good point that identity is often the way of, you know, persecuting people and killing them, and yet then we heard about a biometric that could be unique, and there could be 0 false positives from birth, which just, those two things are so incompatible. Is there any, I'd like the panel's view about whether or not biometrics is a slippery slope that would make it inevitable that people are going to face bad consequences?
I'll start on that one. So, yeah, there's a lot of dangers with creating these identity systems, as I said before. But one of the things that are often really helpful are to be able to create uniqueness. I mean, that's one of the things that Aadhaar set out to do in the first place, was to make sure that it identified all of the citizens and all the residents of India. Why? Because of the corruption problems that existed. Why? Because you need to be able to plan to deliver services to individuals. You need to know how many people actually live in a certain area. Just basic stuff like that. So getting those numbers right are useful. The examples I give about healthcare and being able to identify between children, for example, when you're immunising them, is quite important, because that could be a life or death problem for them. But you have to protect whatever you do. If you're going to gather those biometrics, you have to protect them. I think the other thing for me is that biometrics are great for that uniqueness. Personally, I don't think they're particularly good for authentication. So I think once you've got that uniqueness, there are plenty of other ways of interacting with that individual that don't have to start sharing biometric data everywhere again.
But I think the point also is that there must be workflows that don't force people to prove their uniqueness each time, because that's the slippery slope.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's very true. But you do quite often need to get that uniqueness first in many countries because they really have no idea about who's there. Kaliya wants to talk.
I think the widespread use of biometrics for authentication is a pretty major security risk that Western governments have identified. If you read NIST 800-63 and the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, they're like, really just use biometrics for unlocking a physical authenticator. Just don't use them for a lot more than that. And I think I'm really concerned about the kind of that there isn't enough dialogue going on at a global level with human rights centered people focused. Like these dialogues about good ID are important, and I sort of understand them in a different context, having gone to ID for Africa last week. And I don't think that the actual risks around them and their use are being surfaced enough and engaged with enough.
I mean, we are also very much interested in this, the role of biometrics in establishing uniqueness, because we know the importance of uniqueness, and particularly in some of our country clients where, governments are giving large sums of money for subsidy programs, and they've often found, even organizations like UNHCR and WFP and others have found that there's a lot of duplicates and ghosts and others in the system, and so that's one reason for establishing uniqueness. But what are the other forms of establishing uniqueness without biometrics? And that's something that we are actually hoping to pull together a number of key researchers and academics and others who are interested. So if anyone is interested in this, please let us know, because we do want to investigate a bit further.
So I'd love to keep this going. We've had the blinky red light flashing for a couple of minutes now, and there's also buses that are going to be leaving in a few minutes to the party down at the museum. So for folks who want to continue talking, I think we can do so afterwards, or perhaps on the bus ride down we could have take over a bus and turn it into a continuing panel, if that's of interest. Maybe it's a little bit of overkill. But in the meantime, I really wanted to thank you all for sticking around through what I know has been the end of a long day, and to thank Vyjayanti and Adam and Kaliya and all of you for your time in this discussion.